Hi, this is Cory McCarthy, and welcome to a new episode of Fit, Formidable, and Fantastic. That's right, go F yourself. In this episode, I'm kicking off a two-part series regarding how to build bigger arms for your genetics. No cookie cutter programs here. I'm going to get into the bread and butter of how you can build your arms up specifically for you and give you pointers. This episode's all about the biceps. Next week, we're going to hit up the triceps. So, let me start off by saying that everyone has their genetic strengths and their genetic weaknesses, and the arms are no different. With the biceps, you can have higher insertions or lower insertions. Now, with lower insertions, in the case of someone, for instance, like Larry Scott, a popular bodybuilder who is now sadly passed away, Larry had very low insertions, and that gave his biceps this big, long look. Whereas someone like Albert Beckles, for instance, had very high insertions, so he had more of a peaked look. And one way you can determine is if you hold your arm up, you can how many fingers you can stick in the gap between your biceps and your forearm. That's one way to determine what your insertion is. If you can get about 3 or more fingers in there, you have a significantly high insertion on your biceps. If you can get about 2, you have about a medium insertion point. And if you can only fit really about 1 or none at all, you have a very low insertion point for your biceps. Here's a visual aid. So now you can see an example of a high insertion point and a low insertion point. If you're wondering who those were in the photographs, I cropped the arm of Larry Scott for the low insertion point, and I cropped the arm of Albert Beckles for the higher insertion point. Now, the importance of insertion points, because this is where your genetic limitations may come in, and also your genetic advantages as well, is that you can't train fibers that aren't there. For instance, if you have higher insertions, don't think preacher curls, for instance, are going to fill in the gap between your biceps and your forearm. It's not going to happen. You'd be spinning your wheels. Doesn't mean you can't use preacher curls because you still have fibers in your short head of your biceps, but you're going to have to focus more on your long head, which is the peak. And that gets me into the names, the basic layman terms for the names of the biceps heads. There's 2 heads. The inner head, which gives it that wide look, that's your short head. And the outer head, which is more of your peak, is called the long head. Now, if you're someone who's predisposed to a more of a peak, you have a higher insertion point, you want to focus on doing a lot of exercises, for instance, that will accentuate that. Like, for instance, the concentration curl, the hammer curl, the incline dumbbell curl, and ensure that at the stretch point on the bottom of the movement, you really go for a good stretch and then come up and contract hard. If you're someone who has lower insertion biceps, you might get a lot more out of, for instance, preacher curls, standing barbell curls with a very wide grip, dumbbell curls alternating or at the same time with a wider grip. It doesn't mean that you can't work peaking movements as well, but understand you're not as predisposed to having a biceps peak. You're likely going to have more of a longer, fuller look to your biceps, like just a kind of a bigger, longer look. A lot like Larry Scott's, for instance. And there's varying degrees in there. You might have, some have really high insertions, some have very low insertions, and some are somewhere right in the middle. And again, it comes into how many fingers you can stick in the gap there. At the end of this video, you're going to see some example routines for someone with a high and a low insertion point. So feel free to use those. Feel free to swap in some of the exercises I've already mentioned and swap out some of the ones that you have on those example routines I'm going to give you. And as always, make sure you lift, feeling the muscle contract. You challenge yourself with a weight you can fail within the rep ranges I have listed. And you're not swinging around. You got to really make sure you feel it. So it's got to be challenging for you, not trying to compete with the guy next to you who may, like I've said in earlier videos, be doing everything wrong. If you're trying to compete with someone else, you don't know if they're doing things right or not. Just because they're big doesn't mean that they necessarily know what they're doing. And they might be setting themselves up for injury or have been injured in the past and just haven't learned, and you could be following them down that path. So lift smart, lift intensely, fail within the rep range designated for the exercises, and make sure you feel the contraction, the muscle working. So don't be working your front delts when your aim is the biceps. Really, that's about all I have to say about that. Next week, we're going to hit up the triceps. As always, if you have any questions for me at the end of the video, feel free to take my email address and my Facebook details down. Like this video, share this video, get others to like it, subscribe to this channel because there's a lot of great content coming your way. There's a lot of great content currently that I think you could value from. And, stay tuned next week. And if you have any hate mail for me as well, as I've always said, feel free to shoot it my way, and I will feel free to respond, especially if it's something clever. Until then, stay fit, stay formidable, and stay fucking fantastic. I will see you next week.